Hansel and Gretel by the Brothers Grimm. Near the edge of a vast forest lived a poor woodcutter, his wife, and his 2 children, who were named Hansel and Gretel. The family had very little to live upon, and there came a time when the woodcutter had less work than ever before, and no money to buy food for his family. One evening, after the children were sent to bed, the woodcutter and his wife sat up talking about their troubles. The woodcutter's wife, who was Hansel and Gretel's stepmother, and not very nice to them, said, "I know what we shall do, husband. We shall take the children on a long walk into the woods and leave them. They shall never be able to find their way home, and then we shall only have ourselves to look after." "No, wife," the woodcutter was horrified. "That I will never do. How could I leave my children in the forest, where the wild beasts will devour them?" "You fool," replied the stepmother. "Don't believe every tale you hear about the forest. There are no wild beasts in those woods. The children will be safe enough. They will wander to the other side and be found by kind strangers, who will be quicker to take pity on 2 orphans than a family of 4. Let those who have the means take care of your children. Then, when our fortunes change, we shall find them again." And she let him have no peace until he agreed with her plan. Now it happened that Hansel and Gretel had been too hungry to fall asleep, and overheard their wicked stepmother's plan. Fearing the woods, Gretel cried quietly, but Hansel gently hushed her, and, after his parents had gone to bed, he slipped outside to look at the ground. There before the door were many small white pebbles, which shone brightly in the moonlight. Hansel gathered up the pebbles and filled his little pockets. Then he crept inside and went to sleep. The next morning, the children were woken by their stepmother. "Get up, you lazy bones, and come with me to gather firewood." Then she gave them each a piece of bread, saying it was for their lunch, and Gretel took both pieces, as Hansel's pockets were full of pebbles. As they walked away from the cottage, Hansel stopped to look back several times, until at last his stepmother said, "Hansel, why do you keep looking back so?" "Oh, mother," replied the boy, "I can see my little white cat sitting on the roof of the house, and I'm sure she is crying for me." "Nonsense," she replied. "That is not your cat. It is only the morning sun shining on the chimney." Hansel had seen no cat, of course, but he stayed behind to drop a pebble without his stepmother noticing. Soon they reached a thick part of the wood that the children had never been to before. "Come, children, gather up some wood, and I shall make you a fire." Hansel and Gretel obediently gathered branches, and the stepmother made a little fire to keep the children warm. "Stay here, and I shall find your father, who is working in another part of the forest. When we are done, we shall come and fetch you." Without a sign of regret, the stepmother left the children alone in the wood. Hansel and Gretel watched her leave and huddled close to the fire to keep warm. Around noon, they ate their pieces of bread, and Hansel played games with Gretel to keep her from being afraid. Presently, as evening fell, the children fell asleep, and when they awoke, the fire had gone out, and the forest was quite dark. Poor Gretel began to cry, but Hansel patted her on the back and said, "Fear not, Gretel. We shall wait for the moon to appear, and then we shall go home." True to Hansel's words, the moon appeared shortly after, and the small white pebbles shone in the moonlight like newly coined money. The 2 children followed the trail all night long, and when the sun peeped over the hill, Hansel and Gretel were glad to see their little cottage come into view. They ran to the door and knocked, calling for their father. Their wicked stepmother opened the door and looked at them with dismay. "You naughty children! Why have you been staying so long in the forest? We thought you were never coming back." But their father was overjoyed to see them, for it had grieved him to think they had been left in the woods. That night, the stepmother once again entreated her husband to abandon the children. "We have half a loaf left, and when that is gone, there shall be nothing for you nor I to eat, let alone the children." But this time, the woodcutter would not agree, no matter how much his wife nagged at him. Now it happened that once again Hansel and Gretel heard what was said below, and they were overjoyed that they would not be left in the woods again, and so went to sleep with nothing to fear. The next morning, the children were once again woken by their stepmother. She told them that their father had gone into the forest to cut wood, and that they were to bring him lunch. So before noon, the stepmother gave them each a piece of bread, smaller than what she had given them before, and she led them toward the forest. Suddenly afraid, Hansel broke off pieces of his bread and dropped them as they walked, hoping the crumbs would guide them home, as the pebbles had done before. And on they walked, deeper and deeper into the forest, until at last the stepmother made them a little fire and said she would go looking for their father. Hansel and Gretel heard an axe chopping wood, and were put at ease that their father was close. Little did they know that this was no axe, but rather the wind knocking a loose branch against a tree. Time passed, and Gretel shared her little piece of bread with Hansel, and still the sound of the axe could be heard. As evening fell, the two children fell asleep, and when they awoke, night had fallen, the fire had gone out, and the forest was silent. Gretel cried when she realized their stepmother had tricked their father and them, and abandoned them once again in the woods. But Hansel patted her on the back as before and said, "Fear not, Gretel. When the moon appears, we shall find the breadcrumbs and follow the trail back home." But when the moon appeared, the children could not find the breadcrumbs, for the birds had come and eaten up the little morsels Hansel had dropped. Once again, Hansel tried to keep his sister from being afraid. "I am sure we are not too far from home. We shall find it." And so they wandered through the woods, all through the night and into the morning. They found a few berries to eat, but little else. Tired and hungry, they lay down to rest, soon falling asleep, and were woken by the sound of a bird singing over them. The children looked up and saw a beautiful snow-white dove cooing in the branches of the tree. When it had finished the song, it flew away. Thinking it may bring them luck, Hansel and Gretel followed the bird, and were pleasantly surprised when they walked into a glade and saw a strange cottage. To their shock, as the children got closer to the cottage, they realized it was made out of gingerbread, with sweet cakes and tarts, and windows formed out of frosting. "Oh," said Hansel, "look, Gretel! Let us stop here and feast, and when we have eaten our fill, we shall break off some gingerbread and bring it home to father." So the children broke off little pieces of the house and began to eat. Presently, a voice from inside the house said, "Munching, crunching, munching. Who's eating up my house?" The children froze and looked at one another and replied, "The wind, the wind, only the wind," and went back to their eating, too hungry to be wary of the strange voice. Suddenly, the door opened, and an old woman came out, leaning on a stick. Hansel and Gretel were frightened, and the old woman shook her head and said, "Ah, you dear children, who has brought you here? Come in and stay with me a while. There is no need to eat my house, for I have plenty of food inside for you." And so the old woman drew them inside the house and gave them a feast, milk and pancakes, apples and nuts, and wonderful sugary delights. When night fell, she showed them two little beds they could sleep in, and Hansel and Gretel, quite worn out from all the walking they had done, fell fast asleep. But although the old woman pretended to be friendly, she was in fact a witch, and she had built her house out of gingerbread on purpose to entrap children. Once they fell into her power, she would feed them until they became fat, and then cook them for her supper. Fortunately for Hansel and Gretel, the witch was quite old now, and her eyesight was very poor. Early in the morning, the witch stood over the little beds where Hansel and Gretel lay and peered at them quite closely, trying to see who would be the better meal first. She said, gazing at Hansel. "The boy should be first, for he will be harder to control than his sister." And so she laid hold of Hansel and dragged him outside to a little cage, throwing him inside and locking the door despite his protests. She went back to fetch Gretel, who sat frozen on the bed and staring at the witch in horror. "Get up, you lazy creature, and draw some water. I must make a feast for your brother, and you would do well to obey me, or I shall eat you instead." Poor Gretel cried bitterly, but did as she was told, and for many days the witch cooked up a feast for Hansel to eat, which should have made him quite fat, as it did the children before. But every time she went to the cage and ordered Hansel to put his finger through the bars so she could feel how fat he was, lo and behold, his finger was thinner than ever. Now, because of the witch's poor eyesight, she could not see that instead of a finger, what Hansel was really doing was putting a bone in between the bars for her to feel. Hungry, for none of the sugary food could truly satisfy her appetite, the witch got impatient. fat or no, I'll boil him for my supper today." And so she ordered Gretel to fire up the stove and the oven as well. "We shall bake some bread first," the witch told Gretel. "Creep inside the oven and see if it is hot enough to bake the bread." But if Gretel had obeyed her, the witch would have shut her up in the oven and cooked her instead. Fortunately, Gretel was too scared to climb into the oven, and did not trust the witch, and so she said, "I don't know how." "Stupid goose," proclaimed the witch. "Why, the oven door is easy to climb through. Watch!" And the old witch climbed into the oven to show Gretel how to do it. Feeling bold, Gretel jumped forward and pushed the witch into the oven, slamming the door shut and locking it so the witch could not escape. Oh, how the old witch howled and screamed, cursing Gretel. It was quite horrible to hear. And Gretel ran to the cage and let her brother out, saying, "Hansel, Hansel, we are free. The old witch is dead." Hansel hugged his sister and commended her for being so brave. "Come, let us go into the house and take some food for our journey, and then we shall leave to find father." So they went into the house, but Gretel had a surprise to show Hansel, for she had seen where the old witch kept several chests filled with gold and precious stones. The children opened one of the chests, filled their pockets with the witch's treasure, and filled a sack with food, and then they were on their way. They walked and they walked, until at last the forest began to look familiar to them, and soon they had found their way onto a path that led them home. They ran to their house, overjoyed at seeing it again, and knocked at the door, shouting for their father. The distraught man pulled the door open and fell to his knees, overwhelmed at seeing them alive and unharmed. He had not had a moment's peace since returning from town and finding his children were gone and his wife missing. For the wicked stepmother, after she had left Hansel and Gretel, had not made it home. A wild beast had come across her in the wood and killed her. Distraught, the woodcutter had searched the woods, finding his wife's remains, but not his children's, and fearing the worst had befallen them as well. Thanking heaven for their safe return, the woodcutter swept the children into a hug, and was surprised when gold and precious stones fell from their pockets. Laughing, Hansel and Gretel told him of their adventure, and the three of them lived happily ever after. The end. And now that we have come to the end of our stories for the night, you may stay in the glade until dawn, for the fire shall keep away the beasts of the forest. Farewell.